The wine hit my face before I even heard the gasp from the room. 43 people watched in silence as Cabernet Sauvignon dripped from my chin onto the hardwood floors. My son and his wife had just spent 2 weeks arguing over which stain to choose. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there, feeling the cold liquid soak into the collar of my flannel shirt, and looked at my son-in-law's father across the kitchen island like I was waiting for a bus. What Dominic Hargrove didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that I had a folder in my truck sitting on the passenger seat. Inside that folder was a document that would change everything he thought he understood about the evening he'd just decided to make memorable. This is the story of what happens when a man mistakes silence for weakness and kindness for stupidity. And if you think you know where this is going, I promise you, you don't. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 63 years old. For 31 years, I worked as a licensed electrician in Dayton, Ohio. And for the last 8 of those years, I ran my own company, Briggs Electrical, with 11 employees and contracts with 4 commercial developers in the region. I drive a 2016 Ford F-150 with a cracked passenger side mirror I keep forgetting to fix. I wear flannel shirts because I like them, not because I can't afford anything else. My late wife Carol used to say I'd wear flannel to a black-tie dinner and somehow make it look intentional. Carol died 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the day I held her hand in room 211 at Miami Valley Hospital and listened to the sound of a monitor going flat. She was 58 years old and she was the most capable person I have ever known. Our son Jason is 32. He's a structural engineer at a firm in Columbus. He's quiet, methodical, patient in ways that sometimes remind me so much of Carol that I have to look away. 2 years ago, he married a woman named Brittany, whose father, Dominic Hargrove, built a real estate development company from an inheritance his own father left him, and has spent the better part of 20 years making sure everyone in the greater Columbus metro knows about it. Hargrove Premier Properties. You've seen the billboards, the ones with his face on them, slightly younger than he actually looks, smiling like a man who has never once been inconvenienced. I want to be fair. I don't dislike Dominic Hargrove because he has money. I've had money too in my own quieter way. I dislike him because of the particular way he uses it, like a measuring stick he holds up to everyone he meets before deciding whether they're worth a full sentence or just a nod. The first time we met at a dinner Jason and Brittany arranged 6 months before the wedding, Dominic shook my hand firmly, looked at my truck in the restaurant parking lot, and said, "So you're in trades?" Not a question. A filing system. He'd already sorted me into a category before the bread arrived. His wife, Linda, is different. She laughs easily, asks real questions, remembers details you mentioned weeks ago. At that first dinner, she asked me how I met Carol, and when I told her about the church fundraiser where Carol outbid me for a pie I'd actually baked myself, Linda laughed until she had to set down her wine glass. Dominic checked his phone. At the wedding, I sat at what the seating chart called the family table, though Dominic had arranged it so his side occupied the round table near the dance floor, while Jason's family, which meant me, my brother Phil, and our Aunt Ruth, who drove 3 hours from Cincinnati, were seated near the side exit next to the DJ equipment. I didn't say anything. Carol always told me you learn more about a person by watching how they arrange things than by listening to what they say. The house came about 8 months after the wedding. Jason and Brittany had been renting a condo in Dublin, and when Brittany found the property in Worthington, 4 bedrooms, newly renovated kitchen, and a yard with a mature oak tree, she said, reminded her of her grandmother's place. They wanted it immediately. The asking price was $487,000. A beautiful house. More than Jason's salary alone could comfortably handle, especially with the student loans he was still managing from his master's degree. Now here is where I need to be precise, because the people at that housewarming party made a set of assumptions about what happened next, and those assumptions are what made Dominic Hargrove feel comfortable picking up that wine glass. What everyone assumed was that Dominic Hargrove had helped Jason and Brittany buy the house. Dominic had certainly allowed that impression to exist. He mentioned it at family gatherings in the vague way wealthy people mention their generosity, never directly, always in the context of other things. When we were helping the kids get settled, he'd say, or after we made sure they had what they needed. Nobody pushed for details. Nobody asked the specific question. And Dominic, to his credit as a strategist, if not as a man, never actually lied. What actually happened was this. 3 years before Jason and Brittany got engaged, Carol sat me down at our kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee, and told me she wanted to restructure her life insurance policy. She'd been reading about family real estate trusts, about the ways parents could quietly position resources to help children without creating dependency or obligation. She was a bookkeeper for 22 years. She understood money at a molecular level, the way some people understand music. "I want to set something up," she told me. "Not for us, for Jason. For when he's ready to build something." We created a trust account together, naming it the Carol Ann Briggs Family Security Fund. We funded it over 3 years with money we'd been saving since Jason was in middle school, money Carol redirected from our own retirement contributions, money from the sale of a rental property we'd held since 1998. When Carol died, and her life insurance paid out, the bulk of it went directly into that fund, per her own written instructions, which she'd updated 6 weeks before her diagnosis, almost as if she knew, though she swore to me she didn't. The fund's total balance when Jason told us he and Brittany had found the house was $214,000. I transferred $180,000 to the escrow account through the trust's bank, First Federal in Dayton. The transaction showed as CBF Security Fund beneficiary transfer. Not Walter Briggs, not Dad. The trust. Jason knew the money existed because Carol had told him before she died that she'd arranged a foundation for your future, baby, so you can build something real. He knew it came from his mother. He did not know the full amount, and he did not know I had continued contributing to it after Carol's death, or that the fund had grown to the point where it covered nearly 40% of the purchase price. Brittany knew they'd received family support for the down payment. She assumed, as did Dominic, that this meant Dominic's family. I never corrected that assumption. Neither did Jason, partly because he's not a confrontational person, and partly because explaining the full structure of a family trust at Sunday brunch seemed unnecessarily complicated. The housewarming party was Brittany's idea. 43 guests, catered appetizers from a place in Upper Arlington, a cheese board that cost more than my first electric bill at the shop. Brittany had worked hard on the details, and it showed the house looked warm and lived in already. Photographs on the shelves, a throw blanket on the couch that Carol would have called the good kind of cozy. I drove up from Dayton that afternoon in the F-150. I was wearing a flannel shirt, a clean one, dark green, which I'd ironed myself. I brought a bottle of bourbon I'd been saving, a Pappy Van Winkle 15-year that a client had given me when we finished rewiring his commercial warehouse in 2019, and that I'd kept in the back of my closet because I never found quite the right occasion. Jason's first house seemed like the right occasion. Dominic met me at the door before I could knock. He had the particular energy of a man who considers himself the host of any room he enters, regardless of whose name is on the deed. He was wearing a blazer over a cashmere sweater, which is a combination I've never fully understood, but which seems to function as a uniform for a certain kind of Ohio businessman. Walter. He shook my hand with the firmness that was always slightly more pressure than necessary. "Glad you could make it. Long drive from Dayton?" "About an hour. Not bad." His eyes moved to the bourbon in my hand, and something in his expression adjusted. "Brought a little something. That's thoughtful." I handed it to him. He looked at the label, and I watched the moment his face recalibrated the bottle was worth $200, and he knew it. For 1 second, he didn't quite know what to do with the information. Then the smooth expression returned. "Come on in. Let me get you something to drink." The party was already comfortable and full when I arrived. I found Jason near the kitchen talking to his friend Marcus from the engineering firm. My son lit up when he saw me, crossed the room in 4 steps, and hugged me the way he's hugged me since he was a kid, with his full weight, briefly, like punctuation. "Dad, you made it. Come see what they did with the back room." We spent the first hour well. I talked to Linda Hargrove near the window seat, and she asked about my brother Phil's recovery from his knee surgery, which she'd remembered from a conversation 3 months earlier. She was the kind of person who made a room feel like somewhere you'd chosen to be, rather than somewhere you'd been positioned. The trouble started gradually, the way it usually does. Dominic gathered around him, as he tended to do, a small orbit of guests who were either impressed by him or employed adjacent to him. He was talking about the house with the comfortable authority of ownership, gesturing at the kitchen renovation, mentioning the structural changes in the open floor plan, describing the yard's potential as if he'd scouted the property himself. It was the right time to move, he said to a man named Greg, who I later learned was one of Dominic's golf partners. Interest rates being what they are, you have to know when to act. We saw the opportunity, and we positioned the kids to take it. I noted it, said nothing. Dominic really came through for them, Greg said to his wife, gesturing vaguely in my direction as I stood nearby. Family support makes all the difference. I smiled at Greg's wife, who smiled back at me with the polite vagueness of someone who'd been to many of these parties and had learned to smile at men near the cheese board. I found a spot near the back hallway and talked to Brittany's college roommate for a while about her work as a speech therapist. Good conversation. Grounded person. I was having a perfectly acceptable evening. Then Dominic tapped a knife against his wine glass. If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment. The room gathered. Jason stood next to Brittany, his arm around her waist, his expression, the slightly uncertain one he gets when he suspects something is happening that he didn't fully approve in advance. Dominic smiled at the room with the practiced ease of a man who'd given many toasts. I just want to say a few words about this house, and about these two people who are building something real here. He talked about Brittany first, her drive, her taste, her ability to see potential in things. He said she got that from her mother, which made Linda laugh and press her hand to her chest. It was genuinely charming. I'll give him that. Then he pivoted. A home like this doesn't happen without family, without people who have the resources and the vision to make it possible. He raised his glass. Linda and I are so proud to have been part of making this happen for Brittany and Jason. This house is a reflection of what family can do when it shows up. Applause. Genuine and warm. Brittany had tears in her eyes. Jason was clapping too, though his face had a complicated quality. I recognized the expression of a man who knows something is slightly off but can't locate it precisely. I was clapping too, politely, waiting. Dominic caught my eye across the kitchen island. And here is where I believe he made his decision. In that single moment of eye contact. Something shifted in his expression. I think he saw me standing there in my flannel shirt next to the Sub-Zero refrigerator and decided that the evening needed one more note of clarity about the social geography of the room. He gestured in my direction. And of course, Walter Jason's dad drove up from Dayton. Glad you could be here. The exact tone a person uses when they include someone in a photograph, because it would be rude not to. Several heads turned toward me. I nodded, smiled. Walter's in electrical work, Dominic continued, in the smooth, informational tone of a man explaining exhibit labels. Salt of the earth. Good, honest work. He picked up the bottle of Pappy Van Winkle from where it was sitting on the counter, turned it in his hands thoughtfully. Brought a nice bottle, too. That's very generous on a tradesman's budget. The room went a register quieter. Not silent, but quieter. I felt Jason go still across the room. Dominic. Linda's voice had a warning in it. I'm just making conversation, he smiled and set down the bottle. What I mean to say is, it's good to have everyone here. People who could help and people who he paused, and I watched him make the decision, the specific decision to say the thing he was building toward people who came to celebrate. Every party needs both. People who could help and people who came to celebrate. The distinction, delivered in front of 43 people, was a door closing in my face, in my son's own kitchen. I heard someone near the back of the room inhale. I didn't move, didn't change my expression. I set my wine glass down on the counter very carefully, the way you set something down when you want your hands free. Then Dominic picked up his wine glass and, in what I can only describe as the physical expression of the point he'd just made, leaned across the kitchen island and poured what remained in his glass, a generous Cabernet, very red, very cold, directly onto the counter in front of me. It splashed across the edge and caught my shirt. Whether it was deliberate or a gesture that got away from him, I will never fully know. What I know is that he looked at the stain on my shirt and said, calmly and clearly, "Oh, Walter, I'm sorry. You should probably get cleaned up. The guest bathroom is down the hall." And then he turned back to Greg and continued a sentence. He turned his back on me, in my son's kitchen. The room was silent now, fully, completely silent. I could hear the refrigerator hum. Jason had gone the color of paper. Brittany's hand was over her mouth. Linda had set down her own glass and was looking at her husband with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not embarrassment, which I might have expected. Something heavier than that. I reached into the back pocket of my jeans and took out my phone. Not quickly, deliberately. The way you check something you've already checked before and already know the answer to. I opened the First Federal banking app. I found the account under Trust Management. Carol Ann Briggs Family Security Fund. I looked at the transaction history, 48 individual transfers over the course of 4 years, totaling $214,000 in contributions, with $180,000 dispersed to the escrow account on the date of the Worthington property closing. I looked up at the room. "Dominic," I said, "I want to make sure I understand what you said. People who could help, and people who came to celebrate. Is that right?" He turned back, the smooth smile already deployed. "Walter, it was just, I want to show you something." I held up my phone, turning it so the screen faced the kitchen island. This is the First Federal Trust account for the Carol Ann Briggs Family Security Fund, named for my wife Carol, who died 4 years ago. I let the room absorb that. My wife spent 3 years before her death setting up a financial trust for our son. She redirected her own retirement contributions, sold a property she'd held for 2 decades, and when she was gone, her life insurance payout funded the balance. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. The down payment on this house, I continued, came from that trust. $180,000, transferred to escrow at closing. I scrolled to the transaction record and held it up again. 40% of the purchase price. I heard Greg's wife say something very quietly that I didn't catch. Jason was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on my son's face, a compound emotion, grief and recognition, and something cracking open that I think was the moment he understood for the first time the full shape of what his mother had done. "That's Dominic started. I'm not finished." I set the phone on the counter. Screen up. My wife worked as a bookkeeper for 22 years. She did not come from money. She came from a family in rural Kentucky where her father worked at a grain elevator and her mother cleaned houses on Saturdays to put Carol and her sister through community college. She built what she built by understanding exactly where every dollar went. The flannel shirt was still wet. I didn't touch it. She believed that a parent's job was to give their children a foundation, not a dependency. So she built this fund quietly, without announcements, without toasts, without anyone needing to know her name on a billboard. I looked at Dominic directly. She died, without ever seeing the house she helped buy. She died in room 211 at Miami Valley with a ceiling tile above her, and my hand in hers, and the absolute certainty that what she'd arranged would matter to someone she loved. Linda Hargrove was crying. I noticed that. Not performing crying, the real kind, quiet, contained. Dominic's face had changed in a way I don't have a perfect word for. The billboard smile was gone. Underneath it was something that looked less like embarrassment and more like a man who has just realized he has been standing in a room whose architecture he completely misread. "The trust is managed by First Federal in Dayton," I said. "The transaction records are auditable. The closing documents list the funding source as CBF Security Fund, which you can verify with the title company." I picked up my phone. "I have the attorney's contact information if you'd like to confirm any of this." "Dad," Jason's voice came across the room. I looked at my son. He was standing very straight, in the way he stands when he is holding something heavy. I knew Mom had set something up. She told me before he stopped. Cleared his throat. "I didn't know how much." "She didn't want you to," I said. "She didn't want it to feel like an obligation. She wanted it to feel like a door being open when you needed it." Brittany sat down on the arm of the couch. She'd gone very still. Dominic cleared his throat. "Walter, I'm not angry with you, Dominic. This was true. I want to be accurate about that. What I felt was not anger. It was something more like the specific tiredness that comes after you've been patient for a long time about a thing that didn't require patience. That could have been avoided entirely by a single person being less afraid of who he was in a room. I don't need an apology. What I need is for you to understand what you just stood in front of 43 people and minimized. The silence held. Then I reached into my jacket, which was hanging over the back of the kitchen stool, and took out the folder. I had brought it in from the truck during the first 20 minutes of the party, before Dominic's toast, tucking it into my jacket without saying anything about it to anyone. Not because I came here planning this moment. I brought it because Carol always taught me that a man who has nothing in his hands can still be made to feel like he has nothing. Carry your documentation, she used to say, not to wave around, just to know it's there. I set the folder on the kitchen island and opened it. The first document was the trust establishment paperwork, dated November 14th, 2019. Carol's signature was on the third page, her real signature, the looping careful one she used for legal documents, not the quick shorthand version she used for grocery lists. I had looked at that signature more times in the past 4 years than I could count. This is the original trust document, I said. Carol drafted it with our attorney James Whitfield in Dayton, 18 months before she was diagnosed. She did not know she was sick when she started this. She did it because she believed in planning, in building things with intention. I looked around the room. She believed in the kind of provision that doesn't require gratitude because it was never done for gratitude. Dominic reached out and took the document. His hands, I noticed, were steady. He had the physical composure of a man accustomed to controlling rooms, but when he read Carol's signature at the bottom, his jaw tightened in a way that was involuntary. The second document, I said, placing it on the island, is the life insurance disbursement record. Colonial Life, policy number 4471B, dated March 22nd, 2021. The payout was $190,000. Of that, $160,000 went directly into the trust account per Carol's written instructions, which she updated. I paused, because this part still catches me sometimes 6 weeks before her diagnosis. February of 2020. She updated the policy in February, and we got the diagnosis in April. The room was quiet in the way that only happens when a group of people are all doing the same emotional work at the same time. She knew. Someone near the back said softly. A woman's voice. I didn't look to see who. She told me she didn't, I said, and I believe her. Carol was not a person who kept that kind of secret. She updated the policy because she updated things regularly, because that's who she was. But sometimes I think about the timing, and I wonder if she felt something she didn't have language for yet. Jason sat down at the kitchen table. He put his hands flat on the surface, the way he does when he's containing something large. I placed the third document on the island. These are the quarterly contribution records. From 2019 through 2023, I continued adding to the trust from the company's operating account and from personal savings. 11 contributions over 4 years, averaging $3,100 each. I smoothed the paper flat. My contribution to this down payment was not a man on a tradesman's budget stretching to be generous. It was a man honoring a plan his wife made and making sure it reached the finish line she couldn't. Dominic set down the original trust document. He did not say anything. There are moments where the absence of words is its own information, and this was one of them. Greg, his golf partner, had moved quietly to the edge of the room near the hallway. The woman beside him was studying the floor. The social geography of the room had entirely rearranged. Brittany finally spoke. Her voice was careful, the way people's voices get when they're managing something in real time. Mr. Briggs. She stopped, started again. My dad said we all assumed. She looked at her father. Dad, you let us think? Brittany. Linda Hargrove spoke with quiet firmness. Your father and I will talk later. I want to understand what actually happened. Brittany's voice was steady. She is, I've always thought, a stronger person than the version of her that appears at family dinners. Were you aware that the down payment came from Jason's mom's trust? Were you aware it wasn't from your money? The room waited. Dominic straightened slightly. I knew there was family support involved. I didn't know the specific source. But you let people believe it was ours, Linda said. Not a question. Linda, at the wedding, at Thanksgiving, tonight. She was not raising her voice. Linda Hargrove was, in this moment, absolutely precise. You said we positioned the kids, You said we made it possible. Tonight you stood in front of their friends and separated people into those who helped and those who showed up. And the whole time you knew, or you should have known, because it was in the closing documents, Dominic. We were copied on the closing documents that the primary funding came from Jason's mother's trust. Dominic had no answer for this. He had the look of a man who is used to having answers and has reached the specific, awful moment of running out of them. I closed the folder and set it aside. I want to say something to everyone in this room. I looked around at the 43 people who were all very still and very present in a way that party guests rarely are. Carol Ann Briggs grew up without much. Her family's version of financial planning was hoping the car held through another winter. She spent her entire adult life learning, slowly and deliberately, how to build something that would last. She did it without shortcuts, without inheritance, without anyone making a toast in her honor. I looked at Jason. She knew your grandfather worked at that grain elevator until his back gave out. She knew what it felt like to have less than the people around you and to watch those people mistake your less for a verdict on your worth. She didn't want you to ever feel that way if she could prevent it. So she built you a foundation, and she built it quietly, the way she built everything without needing to be seen doing it. Jason was crying. He was trying not to, the way men in their 30s try not to cry in rooms full of people. But his shoulders were doing the thing, and his jaw was tight, and it wasn't working. The house is yours, I said. Yours and Brittany's. Fully, completely, without condition. It came from your mother's belief in who you were going to become, and from 40 years of Carol Briggs deciding every single day that the people she loved were worth the effort. I picked up my jacket from the stool. That's what I came to celebrate tonight. I walked over to Jason and put my hand on the back of his neck the way I used to when he was small, and he leaned into it for a moment like he was still 12 years old, and the world had just been harder than expected. She would have loved this house, I told him quietly. She would have loved the oak tree. He nodded, couldn't speak. I shook Brittany's hand, which she immediately turned into a hug, which surprised me and which I was grateful for. I said goodbye to Linda, who held my hand in both of hers and looked at me with an expression that didn't need translation. I did not say goodbye to Dominic, not out of cruelty. I simply had nothing left to say to him that needed to be said in front of that room, and he knew it. I walked out through the front door, down the porch steps, and out to the F-150 with the cracked mirror. I sat in the truck for a minute before starting the engine. The folder was still in the truck. I put it back in the glove compartment. The drive back to Dayton is an hour and 15 minutes on I-70. I made it in about that, with the radio off. The calls started somewhere around Reynoldsburg. The first was from Jason. He talked for 7 minutes, mostly without complete sentences, trying to tell me several things at once about the trust, about his mother, about the house, about a conversation he'd had with Carol the week before she went into hospice, where she told him she had arranged some things and he hadn't fully understood until tonight what she meant. I let him talk. When he got to the end of what he needed to say, I told him his mother had known exactly what she was doing, and that she would have been proud of the man he was in that room tonight. He asked me what I meant. I told him I meant the way he'd sat at that table and held still while something hard was happening, which was a thing Carol had always considered a form of strength. The second call was from Linda Hargrove. She apologized first, without qualification or context, simply, "Walter, I am sorry," and then she told me something I didn't know, which was that Dominic had, in fact, been copied on the closing documents, and had seen the CBF Security Fund listed as the primary funding source. He had not told Linda. He had not told Brittany. He had allowed the assumption to continue because, Linda said, my husband has spent his whole life making sure people know what he's provided, and acknowledging that someone else provided the most significant thing would have required a kind of humility he hasn't developed yet. She said this without bitterness, with the calm of a woman who has understood a thing about her husband for a long time without yet knowing what to do about it. I told her I appreciated the call. I told her I didn't think Dominic was a bad man. I thought he was a man who had built his identity around a particular kind of providing and who had encountered a form of provision he didn't recognize, because it didn't look the way provision was supposed to look, according to everything he'd believed about the relationship between money and dignity. That's a hard thing to have challenged in your 60s, I knew something about that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Jason's mother sounds like she was an extraordinary person. She was ordinary, I said. That's what made her extraordinary. She didn't do any of this because she was exceptional. She did it because she was paying attention and she cared more about the outcome than the credit. Linda said she was going to talk to Dominic that night. I told her that whatever came of that conversation was between them, and that I meant it. The third call came 2 days later, from Dominic himself. I was at the shop doing a supply inventory when my phone rang, and when I saw his name, I sat down on a bucket of conduit and let it ring twice before answering. He didn't start with an apology. He started with a question, which I respected more than I expected to. He asked me how much of the trust Carol had set up before she knew she was sick, and I told him all of it, which was the truth. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me how a person starts something like that on a bookkeeper's salary. I told him the same way you start anything. You decide it matters more than the things you'd spend the money on otherwise, and you start small, and you stay consistent, and you don't wait until you have enough to feel like it counts, because that feeling never comes. I told him Carol had started with $80 a month in 2017, automatic transfer, barely noticeable, and that she'd told me it was the kind of money that doesn't feel like sacrifice today, but becomes something real later. He was quiet for longer this time. I've been telling the story wrong, he said finally. It was not phrased as an apology. It was phrased as a man correcting an error in a ledger, which is actually, if you know anything about Dominic Hargrove, a more sincere thing for him to say. You were telling the story you thought was true, I said. That's a different problem than lying. But it's still a problem, I know. Talk to Jason and Brittany, not to me. He said he would. I think he did, though that conversation belongs to them and I don't have it secondhand. The social media part I was not prepared for. Someone at the party had recorded the portion after Dominic's toast from the wine incident through most of what I said about Carol. I found out because my brother Phil called me Thursday morning and told me there was a video with my back and part of my face in it that had accumulated a significant number of views. I watched it once. I am not a person who watches videos of myself more than once, but I saw what people were responding to, and it was not what I expected. Most of the comments were not about Dominic. They were about Carol, about a woman they'd never met, who appeared in the video only as a name on a document and a description given by a man in a wet flannel shirt, and who had apparently, through the act of being described, become real to strangers in a way that moved them. There were comments from people who said they'd called their parents after watching it. Comments from people who said they were setting up savings accounts for their children that same evening. Comments from people who said they'd spent years assuming that provision looked like Dominic's kind of provision, visible and announced, and that watching the video made them think about the invisible versions of it that had structured their own lives. One comment said, "The quiet ones always hold the cards." I read that and thought about Carol's voice at the kitchen table with her legal pad and her coffee and her $80 a month, and I thought, no, the quiet ones are just the ones who don't mistake the announcement for the thing itself. I received a call from the director of a financial literacy nonprofit in Columbus who had seen the video. She asked if I would be willing to come and speak to a group of young professionals about estate planning, family trusts, and intergenerational wealth building. I told her I was an electrician, not a financial advisor. She said that was exactly why she was asking. I said I'd think about it. I have thought about it. I'm going to say yes. The house in Worthington has an oak tree in the backyard that, according to Brittany, loses its leaves later than all the other trees on the street. She sent me a photograph in November of Jason standing under it with his hands in his pockets, looking up. He looks like himself in that photograph. He looks settled. He looks like someone who knows the ground under his feet. I have a copy of the trust establishment document framed in my office at home. Carol's signature, on the 3rd page, the looping careful one. Some mornings I look at it for a minute before I start the day. Not out of grief, or not only out of grief, out of the specific recognition that some forms of love are too large for the moment they're given in, that they have to be planted and left to grow and discovered later by people who are finally ready to understand what they're standing in. There is a guest bathroom in the house in Worthington, down the hall from the kitchen. It has white subway tile and a small window above the sink. I have used it twice now when visiting, and I always wash my hands slowly, looking out that window at the oak tree. And think about the quiet woman who built the foundation this house stands on, and who never once needed anyone to announce her name. If you're watching this, and you've spent years assuming that the people making the biggest difference in your life are the ones with their names on the largest things, look again. The person who stayed consistent when it was inconvenient, who put $80 a month into a future they might not live to see, who updated their insurance policy in February without telling anyone why. Those are the people holding the cards. They just don't play them loudly. And if you've been the person in the blazer at someone else's kitchen island, deciding who in the room belongs, I hope you get a chance to see the folder before you make that decision. Most of us do, eventually. Subscribe if this story meant something to you. I'd like to know where you're watching from, because the people who built things quietly deserve to know their story traveled far.